This is Ashley Day, inviting you once again to join us as we seek to answer the question, what does the Bible say? Please turn in your Bibles to John chapter 12. John chapter 12. There's a deep symbolic meaning to the triumphal entry of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem. It fulfilled the prophecy of Zechariah in every detail concerning the king who would one day come to his people. John gives the general sense of Zechariah's words here in verse 15, but he leaves out some important details. When you look up the prophecy itself, its fulfillment becomes the more remarkable. You see, John merely says, "Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king comes, sitting on an ass's colt." Well, that's certainly what Jesus did. But John's quotation doesn't do justice to the original proclamation. Zechariah wrote, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes unto you. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, upon a colt, the foal of an ass." John said, "Fear not." Zechariah said, "Rejoice greatly and shout." John merely said, "Your king comes sitting on an ass's colt." Zechariah said, "He is just, having salvation and lowly." And how beautifully that described Jesus. First, nobody, not even the Pharisees, could accuse him of being unjust. His whole life and ministry demonstrated truth and righteousness. Second, he had consistently presented himself as the channel of salvation. And he confirmed his claim to divinity by the miracles that he'd performed. And yet, despite all that, third, he was lowly. He never put on any airs and graces. He lived as one of the common people, often without a place to rest his head. And now he was content to ride into his capital city amid the acclamation of ordinary folk who had seen him at work and who recognized him as their Messiah. It's surprising to me that the Pharisees and the priests, who were students of the Old Testament and its prophecies, couldn't see this remarkable fulfillment taking place before their eyes. And yet such is the blindness of men without God. They did not see because they could not see. That was their problem. By contrast, many in the crowd of ordinary people upon whom the Pharisees looked down with disdain recognized Jesus for who and what he was. It's another clear illustration of the fact that God is no respecter of persons, and he reveals himself to whomsoever he pleases, regardless of their place in society. Mary was a nobody in this world, so were Joseph and all the disciples, and yet they were chosen while kings and priests went on in their blindness. Well, this crowd was made up partly of those who had witnessed the raising of Lazarus and partly of those who had heard about it by word of mouth. Verse 17. The people, therefore, who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the grave and raised him from the dead, bore record. For this cause the people also met him, for that they had heard what he had done, and that he had done this miracle. The Pharisees therefore said among themselves, "Perceive you how we prevail nothing? Behold, the world has gone after him." Despite all their efforts to silence Jesus, despite their instructions to the people to notify them if they knew where he was, here he was riding openly into the city amidst the jubilation of the people. It must have been very discouraging, very frustrating for them, to say the least. Verse 20. And there were certain Greeks among them who came up to worship at the feast. The same came therefore to Philip, who was of Bethsaida of Galilee, and desired him, saying, "Sir, we would see Jesus." Philip comes and tells Andrew, And again, Andrew and Philip tell Jesus. Now, of course, there were millions of Greek-speaking people in the world in those days. Most of them worshipped idols. These Greeks were different, however, because we're told specifically that they'd come to Jerusalem to worship. That means that they were proselytes, Gentiles who had been converted to Judaism. Now they approached Philip and they asked to see Jesus. Why Philip didn't go directly to Jesus with their request is not known. Maybe he hesitated because these people were Gentiles. Maybe he wanted confirmation from another disciple before he took action. Most of us tend to be like that from time to time. It doesn't matter anyway. The thing that puzzles me is the response of Jesus to their request. Did he consent to meet with these Gentiles? We don't know. Did he address these next words to them or to Philip and Andrew? Your guess is as good as mine. It would seem most likely that he was speaking to the disciples, in which case we don't know whether he spoke to the Gentiles or not. But certainly the disciples didn't understand what he was saying. Verse 23. And Jesus answered them, saying, the hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Now, let's just think about that for a moment to get our bearings. The word hour is often used in the New Testament to indicate a general period of time, not 60 minutes. Jesus still had 5 days to live, and yet his hour had already come. Jesus, of course, was glorified not so much by his death on the cross as by his resurrection 3 days later, and by his triumphant reception by the Father after his ascension. His glory was his triumph over sin, over death, over Satan. And upon its completion, it became retroactive, so to speak, to include his entire life and ministry. So as we look back from the finished work, we see that his glory was the whole thing, but it didn't come to its fruition until the resurrection. The Lord's next words describe the process whereby this triumph was achieved. Verse 24. Verily, verily, I say unto you, unless a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it die, it brings forth much fruit. Now, Jesus seems to have himself in view here in this verse. He himself was the corn of wheat who would have to die so that much fruit would be brought forth. Just imagine for a moment the harvest which his atoning death produced. Had he saved himself, which he could so easily have done, just like that, had he saved himself, had he opted not to drink the cup of the suffering on our behalf, not one single soul would ever have been saved. Throughout the years of the Old Testament, the sacrifices looked forward to and pictured his death. They were waiting for salvation, but they looked forward to the death of Christ for their salvation to become effective. It wouldn't have become effective otherwise. If Jesus hadn't died, their sacrifices would have been of no use. They were looking forward to the death of Christ. Throughout the New Testament, of course, believers have looked back to that same event. It's the one single event in history which ties everything else together and gives it meaning. Had it not happened, history would have been meaningless. There would have been no hope, no future, no purpose for living. The human race would have been doomed to a useless existence on this planet with nothing to look forward to but darkness and death. And just as a seed must die before fruit is brought forth, so Jesus had to die before souls were saved. Now, someone might say, how could the death of one man make such a difference? I know this is a common question. And the answer is, of course, that the death of no other man could have made any difference. because every other man who ever lived from the time of Adam to the present day has been a sinner, and under the same condemnation. Therefore, Jesus alone, because of the virgin birth, had no blood ties to the sin of Adam, and was therefore free to represent the rest of us. He had to be sinless in order to represent sinners, and no other man ever could. Had Jesus committed one sin, just one small sin, he would have been disqualified and could not have represented us. As it was, he knew no sin, and he who knew no sin accepted in his own body the penalty for all of ours. All of ours. And God was satisfied with the offering. And so the corn of wheat died, and salvation was made possible for millions of souls who were already dead in trespasses and sins. However, having first applied the principle to himself, Jesus then applied it to those who wished to follow him. The same principle. Verse 25. He who loves his life shall lose it, and he who hates his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. If any man serve me, let him follow me. And where I am, there shall also my servant be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor. Now in verse 25, the English word life is repeated 3 times. He that loves his life shall lose it. He that hates his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. Now the first 2 times are the translation of the word psyche, which means soul. The third is the word zoe, which means life. So the object of love and hate in this passage is the soul. Soul. Now the soul is the seat of the emotions and the will. It's the psychological man, the natural man within each one of us. That's why psychology is for the birds. It tries to dress up the natural man, make him better. Can't dress up the natural man, he has to be replaced by a new man. There is no good polishing up the old man, making him better, that doesn't work. So anyway, the soul is the psychological man. And it's that part of us from which lusts and passions and desires and feelings arise. That part within which bitterness and resentment resides. It's the soul that needs to be saved because it is sinful. The Bible says the soul that sins shall die. Now, if I cling to that part of me and allow my feelings and emotions to control me, which is very easy to do, then I cannot fully surrender to Jesus Christ. And I become a slave to my soul. Jesus said, no man can serve 2 masters. For either he will love the one and hate the other, or he will hold to the one and despise the other. That's Matthew 6:24. On the other hand, if I reject it, if I reject the passions and lusts and so on within me, my soul in other words, and I recognize that I must relinquish its fallen condition and drives, then I am free to serve Christ. And let him take over and give me life, Zoe. The words love and hate there are simply Eastern expressions of contrast, like black and white or hot and cold. And they're not used in the ordinary sense, but to drive a sharp division between loving one and hating the other. As the original corn of wheat, Jesus had to reject his human feelings, the feelings within his soul, and choose the path which he would rather not take in order to save us. And now we are called upon to do the same. It applies to us all, from the lowest to the highest.